So look, this is exactly what nobody in Rick Ross's camp wanted the world to see, and yet here we are, staring at it in high definition. With the numbers plastered on every timeline and the jokes already writing themselves before Rick Ross even had a chance to catch his breath. Real talk, if you are watching this right now, do me one quick favor and push this thing forward with a like, because Rick Ross has been dodging this exact conversation for months, and the second we finally sit down to have it honestly, the algorithm suddenly starts acting like it has never heard the name Rick Ross before in its life. Funny how that works. Push it forward, drop your take, and let us drag this Rick Ross situation into the sunlight where it belongs. Now, here's the thing about this whole Rick Ross saga, and I want to say it plain before the timeline gremlins twist it into something it is not. The story of Set in Stone is not really a story about an album. It is a story about a man who spent 20 years telling us he was untouchable, and then walked into 2026 and got touched. Hard. Publicly. By a chart, by a rival, by a fan base that was supposed to be his, and by an algorithm that suddenly stopped picking up his phone. So let us carve into this thing beat by beat, because the receipts on Rick Ross are stacking up faster than anybody in Miami can spin them, and every hour that passes without a real response from the Rosie camp only makes the timeline harder to bury. Understand this. Set in Stone did not just underperform. It face-planted. The official numbers say Set in Stone debuted at number 39 on the Billboard 200 with around 19,000 album equivalent units in its opening week. Some early tracking whispered even lower, with folks throwing around the phrase under 26,000, like it was already a mercy figure. And for a man who once opened weeks at 218,000 copies with God Forgives, I Don't, this is not a soft landing. This is a nosedive with the landing gear still folded up. That is the tell. That is the moment the entire narrative around Rick Ross flipped from boss in retirement to boss in freefall, and the difference between those two phrases is going to be the difference between the next 20 years of his career. And here is where the room gets uncomfortable, because everybody wants to blame the algorithm, and nobody wants to say the quieter thing out loud. Rick Ross picked a fight with the biggest engine in the streaming era, and the engine remembered. So let us just be adults about it. When you insert yourself into a rivalry you had absolutely no business being in, when you spent months dropping little jabs at Drake because you wanted a piece of a war that never had your name on the marquee, you do not get to act shocked when Drake's audience quietly walks away from your rollout. That is not a conspiracy. That is arithmetic. And Rick Ross, of all people, a man who has bragged about being a chess player his entire career, should have seen every single one of those moves coming 3 albums ago. Now, the copy-paste opinions all over social media have been chanting the same tired line. They keep saying Rick Ross fell off, Rick Ross is done, Rick Ross is finished. Slow down. That is not what this is. Rick Ross did not fall off. Rick Ross fell for the trap. There is a difference, and it is the difference between an artist losing his voice and an artist losing his instinct. Rick Ross still has the voice. What he lost was the read on the room. And the room in 2026 is not the room he built his empire in. The room in 2026 is a completely different building, with different lighting, different acoustics, and a completely different crowd, and Rick Ross walked in behaving like he still owned the deed to the old one. Here is the crack in the whole Rick Ross defense, and it is a crack you can drive a boat through. Every apologist wants to point at streaming totals, at long-tail earnings, at car shows, at real estate, at licensing, at all the things that are absolutely valid revenue streams for a mogul at his level. Sure. Fine. Nobody is disputing that Rick Ross is rich. Nobody is disputing that Rick Ross has diversified. But the conversation was never about Rick Ross's bank account. The conversation was about whether Rick Ross could still move a record, and the answer that came back from the market was small, cold, and impossible to spin. 19,000. That is not a mogul number. That is not a boss number. That is a number that would embarrass an artist half his age with a fraction of his machine, and Rick Ross has the machine, the catalog, the cosigns, and the recognition to have done triple that in his sleep 5 years ago. Real talk, let us bring in the comparisons, because the comparisons are where the pain lives. Port of Miami, the debut, moved somewhere in the neighborhood of 180,000 in its opening frame. Trilla did around 190. Deeper Than Rap sat in the same tier. Teflon Don, the record most fans consider his creative summit, cleared 180,000 out the gate. Rich Forever era, Mastermind era, Hood Billionaire era, God Forgives I Don't. 5 solo debuts at number 1 on the Billboard 200. 5. Rick Ross was, for a solid stretch, one of the most bankable first-week artists in the entire genre. And now, in 2026, Rick Ross debuts at number 39. Not 39,000. 39th position. On the chart. This is not the same Rosie. This is not the same rollout. This is not the same era, and Rick Ross forgot that eras have expiration dates, and that expiration dates are non-negotiable no matter how heavy your chain is. But here is where the story gets weird, and it is the part nobody wants to sit with, because it forces everybody to admit something they have been avoiding. Rick Ross's biggest hits are Drake collaborations. Say what you want about the man's catalog, but the songs that made Rick Ross a stadium act, the songs that pulled him from rap boss into pop crossover territory, the songs that grew his fan base from 10 million to 50 million ears, those songs featured Drake. Aston Martin Music. Stay Schemin'. Lemon Pepper Freestyle. Money in the Grave. Gold Roses. When you look at the streaming leaderboards on Rick Ross's own catalog, the top of the pile is Drake, Drake, and more Drake. So when Rick Ross decided to publicly turn on Drake, he did not just pick a fight. He picked a fight with roughly 70% of the mutual fan base that his own commercial career had been built on top of. That is the tell. That is the single most self-destructive commercial decision Rick Ross has ever made, and it is the decision every A&R meeting in America is going to be picking apart for the next decade. Hear me out. There is a stat floating around that hits harder than anything the pundits have said. Somebody actually ran the streaming math on Set in Stone and pointed out that the album, in its first day, was doing streams comparable to what Tory Lanez was pulling from behind bars. Behind bars. Tory Lanez, an artist who is literally incarcerated, an artist with almost no promotional apparatus, an artist who cannot walk into a studio, an artist who cannot show up at a listening party, outsold Rick Ross in first-week units. Tony Yayo pointed it out first, and once Tony Yayo pointed it out, the whole hip-hop internet caught the scent. That is the moment the narrative flipped from Set in Stone is soft to Set in Stone is a full-blown embarrassment. Because the second an artist behind literal walls outperforms your first-week rollout, the argument stops being about music and starts being about relevance, and Rick Ross does not currently have the relevance to argue his way out of that comparison. Now let us talk about the man in the middle of the pylon, because you cannot tell this story without him. Curtis Jackson. 50 Cent. The single most efficient troll in the history of American music. 50 Cent looked at the Set in Stone numbers, looked at the projections, looked at the streaming reports, and did what 50 Cent has been doing for 20-plus years. He picked up the phone, opened Instagram, and turned Rick Ross's chart week into stand-up material. I just saw your record sales, LOL. 2000. What the? That is a real caption. That is not a paraphrase. That is Curtis on a Tuesday, eating breakfast, sniping Rick Ross's rollout in one sentence with a laugh emoji chaser, and every hip-hop timeline in the country woke up the next morning to a Rick Ross meme they did not sign up for. And Rick Ross, to his credit or his detriment, depending on how you frame it, could not let it slide. Rick Ross fired back. Rick Ross asked, publicly, how things were going down in Shreveport, a jab at 50's Louisiana ventures, at the property 50 has been buying, at the film studio conversations, at the whole business play 50 has been running in the South. And that is where the whole thing turned from a chart discussion into a full-blown pay-per-view. Because 50 Cent does not lose these. 50 Cent has never, in the entire recorded history of his career, lost a public back-and-forth of this type. And Rick Ross, whether he wants to admit it or not, walked directly into the same firing squad that has embarrassed artists twice as prepared as him, with twice the ammunition and twice the timing. So look at what happened next. 50 went on Instagram, on stream, on every airwave he owns, and started dismantling Rick Ross piece by piece. He questioned the tour attendance. He questioned the empty venues in Miami. He questioned the buy one get 50% off ticket promotions that started showing up like clockwork after Set in Stone landed. He questioned Rick Ross's last real week of album sales. Triple C's. 4,000 copies. 4,000. 50 put those numbers in the world like a coroner's report, and every hip-hop blog picked up the file. That is not destruction. That is documentation. But when the documentation is that ugly, destruction is not far behind, and Rick Ross has been swinging at ghosts ever since. Real talk though, because the situation deserves it. The most fascinating thing about the Rick Ross downfall is how many warnings Rick Ross ignored on his way to it. There was the disappearance. Somewhere around 2021, Richer Than I Ever Been landed with around 30,000 first-week units, which was, at the time, the lowest opening of his career. That was the first warning shot. Rick Ross should have read the room. Instead, Rick Ross went radio silent for years, drifted further from the recording booth, chased business ventures, chased podcasts, chased headlines, and then decided to reappear in 2026 with a 19-track album and no meaningful promotional runway. That is the tell. Every step of that timeline had a fork in the road, and Rick Ross picked the fork that led here. Here is the crack. Rick Ross tried to sell Set in Stone using controversy instead of chemistry. Every interview Rick Ross gave in the weeks leading up to the release was about somebody else. Drake. Jay-Z, 50. Iceman. He called Iceman horrendous in one sitting. He questioned whether Drake writes his own lyrics in another. He threw strays at Jay-Z on the actual album. He reignited the 50 Cent feud without provocation. And in each of those sit-downs, the actual music, the actual songs, the actual craft that Rick Ross built his name on, got mentioned as an afterthought. That is not a rollout. That is a distraction, and the market punished it accordingly, because the market has an incredible memory for artists who forget to talk about their own art. Understand this. You cannot promote an album by promoting a rivalry. That is a rule as old as the record industry itself. The audience will always follow the drama, but the drama does not convert to sales. The drama converts to clips. And clips do not chart. Rick Ross flooded the internet with clip-worthy moments, and the algorithm rewarded the clips instead of the album. That is why every hip-hop timeline is drowning in Rick Ross content while Set in Stone quietly slides down the charts. Rick Ross became a meme in real time, and Rick Ross became a meme because Rick Ross let the meme replace the music, and the moment a rap album becomes a punchline instead of a project, the streams stop obeying it. Now here is where the story gets darker, because when you look under the hood of Set in Stone, the promotional machinery that used to power Rick Ross's rollouts is simply not there anymore. Maybach Music Group, once one of the most visible imprints in rap, is a ghost of what it used to be. The blog-era vlogs are gone. The MMG Instagram engine has slowed. The signature artists who used to co-sign every Rick Ross release, from Whale to Meek Mill to Omarion to the wider bench, are all off doing their own things, running their own careers, chasing their own bags. Rick Ross is standing on stage by himself, with no army behind him, trying to sell a 20-year-old audience an album in a market that has moved on. That is not a flop. That is a structural collapse. And structural collapses take a decade to reverse, not a quarter. Real talk. The tour tells the whole story. Rick Ross launched Set in Stone with a supporting tour that was supposed to serve as a victory lap for his 20th anniversary in the game. Instead, the seeding charts started leaking, and what they showed was brutal. Green dot after green dot after green dot in venue after venue. Miami. Atlanta. Houston. Dates that should have been layups for a Miami legend were bleeding empty rows. And the team responded the only way a desperate camp knows how. Discounts. Buy one get one 50% off promotions. 2-for-1 bundles. The kind of pricing you slap on a struggling comedy special, not a Rick Ross arena tour. That is the crack you cannot patch, and the moment your tour discounts hit the internet, your rollout is basically over. Here is the crack. Rick Ross's numbers were not shrinking because his voice got worse. Rick Ross's numbers were shrinking because his audience got older, his rivals got smarter, and his allies got quieter. Everybody who used to run interference for Rick Ross in the culture is either retired, distracted, or aligned with someone else. And the new generation of listeners, the fans driving the streaming charts in 2026, do not have the same nostalgic attachment to the MMG era that carried Rick Ross through the 2010s. That is not Rick Ross's fault. That is time. But time is undefeated, and Rick Ross's rollout tried to pretend it was 2013 again. It is not. That is the tell. And pretending never sold a record in the entire history of the format. Now let us bring back 50 Cent, because 50 Cent has been running a masterclass in how to weaponize a rival's low moment. When 50 Cent released the news that he was re-releasing the classic G-Unit sneaker line, Rick Ross posted an insult about it within the hour. Costco. Lloyd Banks high tops better. That was Rick Ross's response. And 50 Cent, being 50 Cent, did not respond directly to the insult. 50 Cent simply posted the set in stone chart position and let the numbers do the talking. Because when the numbers are that lopsided, you do not need punchlines. You just need receipts. And 50 Cent has always understood that the receipts win every long war, no matter how loud the other side gets in the short one. But here is where I want to be fair, because this is not a hit piece. This is an autopsy, and an honest autopsy respects the corpse. Set in Stone as an album is not a disaster. Musically, there are records on there that stand on their own. Mahogany Caskets with 50 Cent, before the feud reignited, sits as a genuine highlight. Minx in Miami samples a classic loop and gives Rick Ross exactly the pocket he thrives in. Ring Around the Rose with Wife and Lucci pulls out a stronger verse than most of the album's headliners. Camel Meat and Maybach Music 7 sit comfortably in the upper tier of latter-day Rick Ross material. Caviar Bump opens the album with the exact luxury aesthetic that made Rick Ross a boss in the first place. City Lights with The Dream has the kind of chemistry that should have carried a full joint project years ago. There is real music here. That is not the argument. Nobody is saying Rick Ross forgot how to rap. The argument is that the album is too long, too unfocused, and too weighed down by filler tracks that dilute the strongest cuts. Face Down with Rich the Kid feels like it wandered in from a different album entirely. Living Large, Purple Fentanyl 23, and Porsche GT3 RS lose the plot in the back half. A tighter 13-track version of Set in Stone might have registered as a lean, mid-career reset. Instead, Rick Ross delivered a bloated 19-track album in a streaming era that punishes bloat. That is not just a rollout problem. That is a curation problem. And in 2026, curation is currency because the modern listener has a shorter attention span than any listener the industry has ever tried to sell to. Now let me pivot, because there is another layer to this that has not been discussed nearly enough. The pick-a-side culture that has infected hip-hop since 2024 has been eating rap careers alive, and Rick Ross may be the biggest casualty of it to date. Understand this. When the culture forced every rapper to publicly line up on either the Drake side or the Kendrick side, Rick Ross made a business decision. Rick Ross went against Drake. And in the short term, that decision looked bold. It looked principled. It looked like a legend picking the winning horse. But the long-term math on that decision has been catastrophic. Because every artist who publicly stood against Drake in 2024 has watched their commercial numbers erode across 2025 and 2026. Every single one. The pattern is undeniable at this point, and Rick Ross is now the loudest name on that list. Here is the crack. Rick Ross's fan base and Drake's fan base were roughly 70 to 80% overlapping. That is not opinion. That is streaming platform data. When Rick Ross alienated Drake, Rick Ross alienated the majority of the audience that had been powering his own streams for over a decade. That is why Set in Stone did not just underperform against Rick Ross's peak. That is why Set in Stone underperformed against literally every reasonable projection. The audience simply left. Quietly. Without a fight. Without a farewell tour. They just stopped clicking play. That is the tell. And once an audience stops clicking play, the algorithm buries the artist inside of a month, no matter how big the name on the marquee is. Real talk, this is bigger than Rick Ross. This is a template. Every artist watching Set in Stone from the sidelines should be taking notes. When you insert yourself into a war that is not yours, you do not gain the winner's audience. You lose your own. And Rick Ross is now the case study that will be taught in every A&R meeting for the next 5 years. The Set in Stone lesson is going to outlive Set in Stone the album. That is the darkest part of all of this. The album will be forgotten. The cautionary tale will not. And Rick Ross, ironically, is going to be more famous for the collapse of this rollout than he ever would have been for its success. Now let us zoom out, because the algorithm conversation deserves more than a hot take dismissal. Ebro Darden was one of the first mainstream voices to suggest, publicly, that Rick Ross's collapse might be tied to the way modern streaming platforms weight engagement. And when you actually look at the mechanics, the theory holds up. Streaming platforms increasingly rely on engagement scoring to decide which artists get pushed into which playlists. Engagement scoring includes skip rates, save rates, playlist ads, and shares. When an artist becomes divisive at the scale Rick Ross became divisive, the skip rate spikes and the save rate collapses. Once those two metrics tilt, the algorithm quietly demotes the artist across dozens of curator-driven playlists. And once you fall off those playlists, the streams evaporate almost overnight. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is documented platform behavior. Rick Ross tripped every one of those wires simultaneously. Here's the crack in the algorithm defense too, though, because we have to be honest on both sides. The algorithm does not hate Rick Ross. The algorithm reflected the audience's behavior. When mutual Drake and Rick Ross fans stopped saving Rick Ross songs to their libraries, the algorithm noticed. When those same fans started skipping Rick Ross records at the 7-second mark, the algorithm noticed. When playlist curators, most of whom lean toward whichever artist is generating the highest engagement in a given month, quietly bumped Rick Ross out of the tastemaker playlists, the algorithm did not do that unilaterally. The audience triggered it. The algorithm just enforced it. That is the tell. Rick Ross is not the victim of a machine. Rick Ross is the victim of a market correction he authored himself. Understand this. Rick Ross's team knows all of this. Rick Ross's team has access to the same data every major label has access to. They can see the skip rates, the save rates, the demographic drift, the geographic collapse in Toronto streams, the drop-off in Drake-leaning markets. They know exactly what happened. And that is why the promotional strategy for Set in Stone leaned so hard on controversy. Because when the traditional promotional levers stop working, controversy is the last cheap fuel a rollout can burn. Rick Ross burned it. It got him clicks. It did not get him sales. That is the lesson. And every artist watching this in silence should be studying it before they light the same match. Now here is a moment that got buried under the sales conversation, but honestly deserves its own headline. Rick Ross, on the album itself, appeared to throw a stray at Jay-Z. Read that back. Rick Ross, in the middle of a rollout that was already bleeding out, decided to take a shot at the single most powerful executive in the history of the genre. Jay-Z. The man whose fingerprints are on every major label deal of the last 25 years. The man whose relationships shape which artists get playlist priority, which artists get late-night bookings, which artists get magazine covers, which artists get whispered about in the room. Rick Ross took a shot at that man. Publicly. On wax. In 2026. And you wonder why the industry is not rallying behind Set in Stone. That is the crack. That is the single most industry suicidal bar Rick Ross has ever put to tape. Real talk, the Jay-Z stray was the moment I stopped seeing Set in Stone as a rollout misstep and started seeing it as a career-defining unforced error. Because you can recover from a soft first week. Artists recover from soft first weeks all the time. You cannot recover from alienating 3 of the 4 most powerful figures in your genre simultaneously. Rick Ross, in the span of one album cycle, put himself on the wrong side of Drake, 50 Cent, and Jay-Z. 3 of the most commercially and politically powerful artists of the last 2 decades. All at once. If there is a strategist advising Rick Ross behind the scenes, that strategist should be fired by sundown, and the paperwork should have been drawn up before the album even leaked. Here is the crack in the whole Rick Ross empire narrative that nobody wants to touch. Rick Ross built his brand on the idea that he was the boss. The boss. The mogul. The strategist. The chess player. That was the entire aesthetic. That was the entire selling point. Aston Martin, cigars, estates, Maybachs, board meetings. But bosses do not fumble rollouts. Bosses do not pick fights with 3 legends in one album cycle. Bosses do not need buy one get 50% off ticket promotions 2 weeks after a release. The Set in Stone rollout did not just underperform commercially. It undermined the brand identity Rick Ross has spent 2 decades constructing. That is the deeper wound. And that is the wound that does not heal in an album cycle, because a brand identity, once cracked, takes years to reforge in the eyes of the public that once believed it. Now let us return to the internet reaction, because the internet reaction has been ruthless in a way even I did not expect. Aiden Ross, the streamer, casually noted that his own live streams were pulling more concurrent viewers than Set in Stone was pulling first-day streams. That was a devastating side-by-side. DJ Academics, whose commentary I take with the seasoning packet from a $5 meal, kept dropping first-week updates that pushed the Rick Ross is finished narrative deeper into the mainstream. Joe Budden weighed in with the diversification will save him defense, which, honestly, might be the kindest thing anyone in the media has said about Rick Ross this cycle, but even that defense is basically a eulogy. When your best defenders are saying, well, he has real estate, the music conversation is already over. That is the tell. Understand this. The commentary booth's leftover buffet plate, meaning the algorithmic outrage class of hip-hop pundits, has been feasting on Rick Ross the same way they feasted on every commercially wounded artist before him. Because Rick Ross gave them everything they needed to build the takedown. He gave them clips. He gave them beefs. He gave them empty tour dates. He gave them soft streaming numbers. He gave them a Jay-Z stray. He gave them a 50 Cent back and forth. He gave them a Drake tension line. He gave them the whole meal. And they ate. Every last bite. That is the crack. And the pundits are going to be dining on this rollout for at least 6 more months. Now let me tell you what Rick Ross should have done, because hindsight is cheap, but sometimes it is also correct. Rick Ross should have skipped the beefs entirely. Rick Ross should have rolled out Set in Stone as a business anniversary album. 20 years of Port of Miami. A retrospective campaign. Documentary content. Behind-the-scenes footage of the Maybach real estate deals, the wing shop expansion, the Anima mixed-use development in Miami Gardens. Rick Ross has an actual business story that is more impressive than most of his rap peers combined. He owns actual property. He owns actual assets. He has diversified in ways that Drake, 50, and Jay-Z all respect. But instead of leaning into that story, Rick Ross leaned into pettiness. And pettiness does not sell 20-year anniversary albums. Legacy sells them. Rick Ross had legacy on the table and traded it for headlines. That is the tell. Real talk. There is a version of this rollout where Set in Stone opens at 70,000 units and gets covered as a triumphant return. That version exists. It was on the table. Rick Ross had the catalog, the cosigns, the business story, the aesthetic, the beat selection, and the guest features to pull it off. What Rick Ross did not have was the discipline to keep his mouth off other people's careers. And that lack of discipline cost him the rollout of a lifetime. The receipts are going to speak for themselves. And when the receipts speak, they always speak louder than the artist trying to talk over them. Here is the crack. Rick Ross's response to the criticism has, if anything, made things worse. Rick Ross went online and said Set in Stone was the album of the year. He said it plainly. Album of the year. That is a claim you can only survive making if the numbers back it up. Rick Ross's numbers do not back it up. Rick Ross's numbers actively refute it. So the moment Rick Ross said, album of the year, every commentary channel, every timeline, every clip factory in the culture took that quote and ran it through the shredder. Because there is nothing the internet loves more than a claim it can dismantle in real time with a screenshot, and Rick Ross handed the internet the screenshot personally. Now let us talk about what happens next, because this is where the Rick Ross story gets genuinely interesting. Rick Ross has 2 paths. Path 1 is denial. Rick Ross doubles down, insists Set in Stone is a classic, insists the numbers do not tell the story, insists the algorithm is rigged, and rides the boss mode narrative into a slow twilight where the tours get smaller, the streams get thinner, and the relevance quietly fades. That path ends with Rick Ross becoming a nostalgia act. beloved, booked, but no longer central. Path 2 is reinvention. Rick Ross reconciles with Drake, reconciles with 50, mends fences with Jay-Z, and pivots the brand toward pure business content. Documentaries, podcasts, real estate, investment education. That path ends with Rick Ross becoming the elder statesman version of himself that his talent has always deserved. Understand this. Only one of those two paths ends with Rick Ross's numbers recovering. And it is not the path Rick Ross is currently on. The receipts are going to speak for themselves. And so far, every receipt Rick Ross has stapled to his own back is pointing toward the path that ends in a legacy tour and a memoir instead of a comeback album. Here is the crack that ties this entire story together, and it is the crack I want you to sit with as you scroll away from this video. Rick Ross was never really a rap battle rapper. Rick Ross was a texture rapper, a vibes rapper, a luxury aesthetic craftsman who painted lavish audio postcards for people who wanted to feel rich for 4 minutes. That is a legitimate art form, and Rick Ross was one of the best to ever do it. Aston Martin music. Diced pineapples. 16. Rich forever. Devil in a new dress. That was Rick Ross at his peak. Confident. Cinematic. Untouchable. But battle rap Rick Ross, feud-mongering Rick Ross, jab-throwing Rick Ross, is a version of the artist that his own catalog never actually supported. And when Rick Ross tried to become that version of himself in 2024 and 2025, he stepped outside the exact lane that made him famous. That is not evolution. That is drift. And the market punishes drift ruthlessly. That is the tell. Real talk. If you have made it this far, you already know how the story ends, because you have seen it 100 times before. An artist forgets who he is. The audience notices. The numbers respond. The pundits pile on. The rivals pounce. The rollout collapses. The narrative hardens. And by the time the artist catches up to what happened, the culture has already moved on. Rick Ross is not the first, and Rick Ross will not be the last. But Rick Ross is the loudest example we have had in years, and the case study will be studied. And every executive with a signing budget is going to be watching Rick Ross's next 12 months to see whether the correction is possible or whether the collapse is permanent. Now, I want to hear from you before we close this thing out. Drop your take in the comments and be honest, because dishonest comments are useless, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Is Set in Stone a flop, or is it a great album that got sabotaged by a bad rollout? Is Rick Ross a victim of the algorithm, or is Rick Ross the architect of his own algorithmic exile? Should Rick Ross squash the Drake situation for the sake of his catalog, or should Rick Ross stand on his principles and let the numbers fall wherever they fall? Tell me straight. I read every one of them. And I promise you the comment section on this video is going to tell us more about the state of hip-hop in 2026 than any streaming chart ever will. Here is the crack. If Rick Ross squashes the Drake situation tomorrow, his catalog recovers within a quarter. Guaranteed. The mutual fan base comes back. The playlist ads return. The algorithm remembers his name. But that requires humility, and humility is not a currency Rick Ross has ever traded in. So the question is not whether the fix exists. The question is whether Rick Ross has the ego flexibility to reach for it. And based on everything Rick Ross has said publicly in the last 30 days, the answer looks like no. That is the tell. And the tell is going to determine every rollout Rick Ross ever attempts again. Understand this. 50 Cent is not going to stop. 50 Cent has, in his entire career, never voluntarily disengaged from a feud he was winning. 50 Cent will keep posting. 50 Cent will keep clipping. 50 Cent will keep dropping first-week comparisons on his Instagram at 3 in the morning until Rick Ross either apologizes, disappears, or delivers a comeback record that shuts everybody up. And Rick Ross does not currently have that comeback record in the chamber. Set in Stone was the comeback record. Set in Stone was the shot. And Set in Stone missed. That is not opinion. That is the Billboard 200. And the Billboard 200 does not care about anybody's aesthetic. Real talk, one final layer before we close, because it is the layer that changes the story. Rick Ross's business empire, the actual business empire, is still enormous. Wingstop, real estate, Anima, publishing, touring, licensing, endorsements. Rick Ross is going to be fine, financially, whether Set in Stone sells another copy or not. That is a fact, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But cultural relevance is not measured in wing sales. Cultural relevance is measured in whether the culture is talking about your music or your business, and right now, the culture is only talking about Rick Ross's business. That is not a comeback. That is a retirement plan. And a retirement plan is not what Rick Ross was trying to sell with Set in Stone. Here is the crack that closes the case. Rick Ross wanted Set in Stone to be his Teflon Don too. His return to form. His reminder to the culture that Rosie was still the boss. Instead, Set in Stone became his cautionary tale. His warning sign. His reminder to every artist watching that even the untouchable are one bad rollout away from becoming a case study. And Rick Ross has to sit with that. For years. Because case studies do not fade. They get taught. That is the tell. Every professor of the modern music business is already writing the syllabus, and Rick Ross is the semester's headline chapter. So look, this is where I leave it. Rick Ross is not finished. Rick Ross is not done. Rick Ross has too much catalog, too much business, and too much residual goodwill to ever fully disappear. But Rick Ross, the culturally central Rick Ross, the first week Rick Ross, the chart-topping Rick Ross, the boss Rick Ross of the 2010s, that version of Rick Ross may have been set in stone right along with the album. And the sooner Rick Ross accepts that, the sooner Rick Ross can start building the next version of himself. The receipts are going to speak for themselves, and history has never once lost an argument with an artist trying to shout them down. Push this thing forward with a like if you rode with me this far. Drop your take in the comments and tell me straight where you stand on the whole Rick Ross situation. Subscribe if you have not already, because we are covering every angle of the Set in Stone fallout as it unfolds, and this story is nowhere near done breaking. And before you scroll away, real talk, you have to see the next one. Because 50 Cent's Shreveport situation is unraveling in a way that even I did not see coming, and the receipts on that story are somehow worse than the receipts on this one. Tap into it, tell me your take, and I will catch you in the next one.